Welcome to Black Hat 2015. There will be a reception tonight in the Business Hall at 5:30 p.m. The Business Hall is located in Shoreline A room. The Pawnee Awards take place tonight in Mandalay BCD at 6 p.m. And you are in Lagoon K for How to Hack Government, Technology as Policymakers with Terrell McSweeny and Ashkan Soltani. Thank you. And then, of course, as in every public speaking type of situation, make sure your phones are on vibrate. No matter how cool you think your ringtone is, it really isn't. So do that for me. With that, guys, it's up to you.
Sweet. Great. Hey, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for making it out.
Am I on?
Is she on?
Am I on? Can you hear me? Yes, in the back. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Awesome. So this talk is How to Hack Government, Technologists as Policymakers. I'm Ashkan Soltani. I'm a technologist in DC. I've kind of had a variety of roles. I've worked for Press, the Washington Post on their Snowden documents. I worked at the Wall Street Journal on a series called What They Know, which was a dive into privacy and security online. And today we're going to give you a brief talk with...
And I'm Terrell McSweeny. I'm a commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission. And as you can probably tell from the difference between our two pictures, I'm the kind of lawyer and policymaker that needs help from people like Ashkan, who's a cool technologist. So my background is FTC, DOJ, White House, the Hill, that kind of thing. I am not a technologist, and mostly I learn from technologists in order to do my work. Just a note about the disclaimer on the bottom of the slide. Both Ashkan and I work for the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, but so do lots of other people as well. And there are 4 other commissioners in addition to me. They don't always agree with everything we say. So today we're here speaking on behalf of ourselves about our experiences working together and why technologists matter and should play a very influential role both in law enforcement and policy making.
Awesome. So today, this talk is, we're going to kind of first lay out what is technology policy, or what do we mean by tech policy, what are the big debates right now, and why do we matter? Right? Why do technologists matter, you guys and me? This isn't a tech talk. We're not dropping any O-days. We're talking about some vulnerabilities, but they're of the human and process kind, not exploits. And to start...
The internet is not something that you just dump something on. It's not a big truck. It's a series of tubes. And if you don't understand, those tubes can be filled, and if they're filled, when you put your message in, it gets in line, it's going to be delayed by anyone that puts into that tube enormous amounts of material.
So this is the famous Senator Ted Stevens tubes quote from the 2006 net neutrality debate. And we included it here because it's kind of funny and because it sort of tees up nicely the fundamental point that we're trying to make, which is that when people are making decisions about laws that relate to technology, they need technologists to help them understand what the impact is on the technology and how it's working.
And to be fair, he wasn't actually totally wrong. It's more
true.
Tubes than trucks or anything else, so, good for him.
So there are a number of policy issues that have a huge technology component that are being debated in Washington right now, and this is a sort of word cloud that includes a lot of them, from privacy policy to cross-border data flows, the right to be forgotten, data security, consumer data security, the Internet of Things, automotive security, today in the Senate, CISA, information sharing. I'm leaving out several.
Wassenaar, we have different groups doing car and medical devices. We talked earlier this morning about CFAA, and it's great to see that this community in Black Hat and DEF CON have been bringing more policy-related presentations just because it's affecting all of us.
But I want to start here at the FTC because every day you take the lead in making sure that Americans, their hard-earned money, and their privacy are protected, especially when they go online. And these days, that's pretty much for everything. Managing our bank accounts, paying our bills, handling everything from medical records to movie tickets, controlling our homes, smart houses from smartphones. Secret Service does not let me do that, but I know other people do.
So this is the president at the FTC earlier this year. Just as an historical note, he was the first president since Franklin Roosevelt to visit the FTC. And he was talking about a bunch of the issues that we focus on at the Trade Commission as it relates to protecting consumers' data security and privacy, especially as we are increasingly connected and the Internet of Things kind of comes online. So he was talking about his agenda, and I think it tees up nicely the huge focus in Washington at the highest levels on these kinds of issues.
And the point he makes is that pretty much everything we do online is online now. So as a society, if you're all of the interactions that Congress would be involved in also have some sort of online or digital component.
So consumers are moving from the brick and mortar world into the wired one. And I want to say a couple of things up front. For those of us that haven't been steeped in this, the US approach to privacy and consumer privacy is this kind of alphabet soup. It's a sector-based approach. It protects certain kinds of information, health information, financial information, children under 13, and then relies mostly on enforcement and to protect privacy promises that are being made to consumers in the commercial sector. Importantly, the focus of this talk is on protecting consumer privacy and data security in the commercial sector and the private sector. We're not talking about today protecting consumer privacy and security from the government. That's a different part of the government than Ashkan and I work in, so we're going to focus on what the FTC has jurisdiction on. So this kind of runs through a bunch of those laws: COPPA, FCRA, Do Not Call Us, CAN Spam, HIPAA, GLB, FERPA, which is the Family Education Records Protection Act. May not be as obvious to many in the room, but that's actually an underpinning of this whole student data privacy debate that's going on. The Telecommunications Act, and a bunch of different state laws. And on the state level, of course, we also see different approaches not only to protecting student data, but also to the kinds of notifications that consumers are supposed to receive if their information was breached. Those are laws that we don't really have. The breach notification laws we don't have at the federal level.
Great.
So the FTC, why are we here? Why are we talking to you about all of these technology policy issues? And how did it come to be that we have technology as a primary focus of protecting consumers? Couple things. One, the FTC just celebrated its 100th birthday. It was created by Woodrow Wilson. He's the guy on the left. It was primarily organized to combat the economic power of the trust at the beginning of the 20th century in America. For those of you that are students of economic history, the trusts were controlled by a very small number of people, and they controlled most of the economy. It was a problem. This was sort of an antitrust problem, and the Trade Commission was created to work with the Department of Justice to protect consumers from unfair competition in the marketplace. But as our mission has evolved, we also protect now consumers from unfair, deceptive acts and practices, which has made us more or less a kind of white hat in protecting consumer privacy and data security. And there's the FTC Act, so we can keep going. That's basically our authority. It's relatively broad, and we've been using it in the last 25 years, particularly to bring consumer data security and privacy cases. But we protect consumers from a range of different kinds of products and advertising practices and things like that. So
I don't know anything about this. Maybe you know something about this. It has to do with the Federal Trade Commission. And apparently there was a product being marketed in the United States. It was caffeine-laced undergarments.
Yes.
The idea was the caffeine in the undergarment, the wearer could lose weight and have less cellulite.
This does not work, by the way.
By putting caffeine in your underpants.
Yeah, it's a real product. And so we bring cases like this against products and advertising practices on things that don't work. A lot of them are weight-related scams and other things like that. We'll call this kind of low-tech consumer protection. It's a very important part of our mission. But our mission also involves technology.
And so in 1914, when we were kind of founded, this was high tech. This was, telecom was just kind of kicking off, phone calls. One of our first cases was about an accounting machine, basically an old school computer. We brought a case essentially about the fact that it did not do what it claimed. And there, again, technology was a key component because we had to understand what accounting machines were supposed to do, what claims were made, and then bring a case against, I think, Accounting Machines, Inc. was the name of the company. And technology's always been a part of our work. So this is, I think in the 60s or 70s, we created, for example, systems to automatically measure tar in cigarettes. It essentially became the FTC method for measuring tar. And it's essentially, building tools, in this case, this mass cigarette smoking machine, which kind of reminds me of last year's Droid Army talk, where you essentially wire up a bunch of droids and test their output. Well, here it's cigarettes. But it's to kind of describe that we do a lot of building and tools and technically related matters to even historically.
All right, so cigarettes, caffeinated undergarments, why do we need technologists? Well, the fact is, as consumers have moved from the brick and mortar world into the wired and connected one, they have been experiencing a bunch of different kinds of practices around their privacy and their data security. And so the FTC 2.0, or FTC at 100, is an agency that has increasingly focused part of its mission protecting consumers, and we do that primarily through enforcement actions. This slide is a snapshot of some of the enforcement cases we've brought against major tech companies in the last 5 years. They involve consumer security and privacy and have been deeply informed by technologists like Ashkan, and we've been expanding our technological capabilities in order to understand when promises are being made to consumers, whether they're being kept, and to really be able to carefully evaluate data security practices in the industry. And we're going to spend a little time going through some of these cases because they really are the underpinning of how we're shaping a lot of the data security and privacy practices using our enforcement tool. So deception. This is a big area for us. And essentially, deception is when consumers are marketed to you in a certain way and rely on that marketing in making their decision to buy the product, but then are misled, and we can bring a case. In this case, it involves consumers being told that they could have unlimited plans or keep unlimited data plans, when in fact they were going to be throttled after certain thresholds were reached. So we said that was deceptive. This case is actually currently in litigation.
And so this isn't a privacy or security case, but again, understanding the underpinnings, the technical underpinnings is critical to this case, right? So the staff had to understand the difference between network management and congestion throttling. Had to understand, for example, when kind of how network routing works in the telco world, which if anyone's looked at GSM or SS7 or some of these obscure non-IP protocols, it's kind of a very different world. And it also has to essentially get into what our practices in the space, what are other companies doing, what is the norm, and try to differentiate whether this practice was harmful to consumers.
Google Buzz. So this is, again, a situation in which we are taking a look at privacy promises that are made to consumers and whether the company has actually upheld them. In this situation, the privacy promise was that to Gmail users, their information was going to be used for Gmail, and it was then used to populate Buzz. And in many, it's a complicated case, but suffice it to say, people weren't really given sufficient notice about how that was going to work. Many of you may recall this. In this case, we resolved it with a consent order, which is a relatively common way that we can resolve cases. It puts Google under order with us for 20 years. We have, within that order, an independent auditor who comes every 2 years to do privacy policy auditing. And for the first time, this was a first for the FTC, required the company to implement a comprehensive privacy policy for consumers and users.
And the way this worked is later, in 2012, I believe, Google also engaged in a practice regarding circumvention of Safari browser settings. And so when they're under order, and that was believed to be in violation of their consent agreement. And so
that's called contempt in legal terms, but it's a good tool for us.
And so then we can bring actual damages and extract money from the entity. That's how our authority works.
Again, privacy promises. Facebook, another case in which we were looking at whether the representations Facebook had made to users about how they could restrict their information were actually true. And in this case, relatively importantly, there was a retroactive change that Facebook implemented. And when they changed that, we said that was also unfair to consumers, that if they had decided their information was going to be handled a certain way, and then you changed your policy about how that information was going to be handled without giving people sufficient control or choice at that point or notice, that that's an unfair practice. So again, in this case, we brought a case and have them under order, again, for 20 years. Comprehensive privacy policy is a part of that, and audits, et cetera.
And here, this was 2010, so if folks remember, Facebook would, for example, make claims about what information you could make public or private, but in fact, if you recall, apps would have access to information regardless of what the user's settings were. And so it involved things like probing the API or developing software to demonstrate what information was accessible. It involved things like we made a claim regarding deletion of photos. So when you would delete a photo on Facebook, in fact, it would still remain in the CDN cache, so people who had the link could still access it. You had things like sharing data with advertisers, and so if people knew how refer headers work and how Facebook IDs would be transmitted to third parties, kind of those key concepts had to be conveyed, and they became a core component of the case. Of the counts there, the technical counts are what we use to allege some of the violations.
NoMe, this is a relatively recent case. This case involves a company whose tech allows consumers to be tracked through their MAC address in retail locations. They had made a promise, though, that they would allow consumers to opt out in retail locations that were using the technology, and that they would provide notice in retail locations of the technology. But they didn't actually require the retailers who were using the tech to provide that notice or that opt-out. So we said that that was a broken promise and that was deception.
Again, and there were some critical concepts that were being debated in this case between staff and outside counsel and NoMe around things like, well, so everyone knows what Wi-Fi signals are, but things around what are Wi-Fi headers versus Wi-Fi content, packet data. There were claims about many of the companies in this space and in the advertising space make claims around anonymity, and so they would argue that they used cryptography to make the MAC addresses anonymous. In fact, effectively they were hashing MAC addresses, but if people know it's a 6-byte, a MAC address is 6 bytes, 3 bytes are kind of the manufacturer, so there's not a lot of variation. You can essentially, it's something like 2 to the 38th, 32nd, to brute force, which is something you can do on a standard laptop these days, or just generate a rainbow table. So we had to
So can I just pause you right there? Like, this is a perfect example of how Ashkan helps me understand what the heck is going on when we're making a law enforcement decision. Because I now know what he's talking about, but I guarantee you at the beginning of that process, I had no idea. Go ahead,
Thanks.
Sorry.
Yeah. And so these claims are understanding these claims and the validity and what the norm is. Like everyone here probably understands that you can download a rainbow table or reverse a hash pretty easily, especially the one that's 6 bytes. But a lot of the policymakers don't realize, and they just go by the claims that the companies can make until they're proved otherwise. And so this is where it's critical to demonstrate and show data and even like show that I can reverse that hash. And so there's a couple of these key concepts that became part of the case. And again, this is a very interesting technology, right? This is promiscuous Wi-Fi sniffing of your devices as you move around even this conference, right? And so there's a persistent trail of where you've been over time by someone you don't even know, and to disable it, you have to either disable Wi-Fi, or there are companies that use GSM, so your IMSI or your TIMSI, to track you as you move about. And so this is a very kind of privacy-laden area anyway. So it's important to get it right.
Snapchat, this is part of the FTC's ongoing work, and I'm sure we'll see more and more of this in coming years, to make sure that apps are being marketed truthfully to consumers. And in this case, our beef was with the concept of ephemerality, that the promise that these messages would disappear when in fact that was not necessarily the case at all. And we also, once we started looking at the tech more carefully, also looked carefully at the security promises that were made to consumers as well.
And again, this is a really great area of where outside researchers also inform policy, right? So there was, I think in 2013, the Strauss-Freeburg guys demonstrated the limitations on a number of ephemeral messaging apps. And everyone here kind of probably can understand how data flows, and when you delete it, unless there's some really neat crypto happening, it's not actually deleted. But it takes the agency researchers like you to alert or highlight some of these facts. And so there's a number of cases, we only cover a few, but there's a number of cases around CSS history. We brought a case against CSS history sniffing. This is when your links change colors. Advertisers would be able to determine in your browser when it's a blue or purple link and identify what other websites you had visited, right? And so that's a neat kind of hacking technique that was demonstrated in some of these conferences, but advertisers were in fact engaged in it. And that, again, that informs us of what to look for or what are some of the state of the art. We also looked at flash cookies. We have a number of technical cases that were very much first alerted. We do our own due diligence and we will dive in, but highlighting this is critical in this space. And so we also take a look at security practices as well. And so folks remember the Carrier IQ hubbub a few years ago, where a researcher had identified kind of a third-party logger on a phone that was, per his claims, tracking users collecting keystrokes on, I think it was HTC phones. We brought a case against HTC for essentially not taking reasonable steps to secure the software developed for phones. And part of it was that they integrated a couple features, including Carrier IQ in their own logger, in a way that, for example, broke the Android permission model, completely allowed sideloading or loading of unsigned code. They shipped with debug equals yes, which essentially logged to basically logged a bunch of extraneous data to the logger, and then they used an INetD type listener, so any other app on the phone could essentially connect and pull data from the logger, kind of thereby again circumventing the permission model and the app sandbox. So they did a bunch of kind of what we would consider in this community dumb things, and we brought a case against them for failure to take reasonable security steps.
So can I just make a legal note here about unfairness and what it means in a legal context? So this is one of those places where the technologists can tell us all about how things are working and where the problems are from their perspective. But then as a lawyer, we have to fit it into what our legal authority actually is. So for us, unfairness is an act or practice that causes or is likely to cause substantial injury to consumers, which is not reasonably avoidable by consumers themselves and not outweighed by countervailing benefits. So basically that leads us to this sort of reasonableness standard that we're applying to consumer data security cases. I should note this is currently in litigation, so we'll see how the authority evolves, but this is how we've been using it. And a really important piece of that for us is that we really strongly believe in being tech neutral. We don't dictate the kind of technology people ought to be using, but what we do say is here are best practices, here's what we believe are reasonable, take your pick, right? Have security by design, have good processes and procedures in place, be doing the basic things that the industry perceives as sort of basic reasonable security.
We also brought cases against some app makers, Credit Karma and Fandango. Fandango is the ticketing app. Credit Karma is an app that lets you check your credit scores for essentially disabling cert validation, right? So they were collecting credit card information and other personal information to check your credit card scores, but they had essentially rendered TLS ineffective because they were, and that's a hot topic. We know, like, one of the car talks today is about cert validation, or tomorrow is about cert validation issues. It's something that happens, and here we allege that this practice, especially when it relates to credit card information, is unreasonable.
And again, in these cases, we're looking at the injury here to the consumers that we're hoping to avoid are security flaws that introduce vulnerabilities to sensitive consumer information, same in HTC and same in these cases as well.
We also brought a case against Trendnet. This is one of the more recent cases and one of our first foray in the IoT, which everyone kind of knows here. This is essentially a camera maker, a remote camera maker that had a secure view capability that allowed individuals to connect to their camera, and they advertised it as being safe to monitor your baby or monitor in a hospital or even in banking environments. But in fact, they had done it in a way where, one, they didn't have any security program. So we don't necessarily look for perfect security, but we would look that the companies that make claims about security have some functionality. And here they were not paying attention to vulnerability disclosures from researchers. They were not patching, and they were allowing the cameras to be remotely accessible if you knew the IP address of the camera. Even if the user had set the option off, you could just pull the stream from the IP address.
So again, here from a legal perspective, we have deception. You're making claims about the security of your product that don't turn out to be true. And we have unfairness, this consumer injury kind of problem. Here, the injury is a little bit different than the cases we were just talking about because it's actually the sort of intrusion into people's personal homes and personal lives. The live feed of their baby cam being on the public internet and available to somebody is a kind of injury that we're concerned about.
And the last one we'll talk about today is an older case called Designerware, and this was a company that was making essentially software for companies that provide rent-to-own laptops. It was a RAT, right? So it was a remote access tool that took screenshots, webcam photos every 2 minutes, keystroke logger. It was designed to not be detectable by AV, and it was, in some cases, detective mode. It was called detective mode that the companies could enable, but they were activated for people that were late to pay their laptop payments. And in some cases, they took pictures of children, individuals not fully clothed, and couples engaged in sexual activities, which is somewhat invasive, we would argue.
Somewhat invasive?
Right? For wanting to get your laptop back.
Yes, somewhat invasive, says Ashkan. I think, from a normal consumer perspective, that's just creepy.
Right. And what's again, this community a Keylogger that's basically TSR that is not, it kind of hides from AV, and that hits the webcam and the screenshots. That's a RAT, right? So we know this in this community, but it's being sold without consumers knowing, and no disclosure, and companies were in fact using this functionality because it was a button they could push.
Oh, this is me.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've been talking about the big stick that we wield, which is our enforcement authority, right? And that's why we spent a little time going through some of these cases, because they are very important in shaping tech policy and shaping privacy policies and security policies at the companies that we especially have under order, but also folks in the industry that are looking at what we're doing. But the other way in which we really try to shape policy is, and also, by the way, inform our enforcement and ourselves about what the right policy ought to be, is by holding workshops and putting together reports and things like that. So recently, in the last year, we've been looking at IoT, obviously, data discrimination, health and fitness wearables. So this is one of those gaps, I think, in information for a lot of people. They know HIPAA, and they sort of think their health information is, and the they here I'm using is like US consumers, is protected sort of because they're familiar with all the HIPAA process from being in the doctor's office or whatnot. But they don't necessarily think of the fact that if they're generating their own health information on a wearable, it's not protected necessarily at all. So there you need to look at whatever the practices of the company that you are sharing your information with and understand it. So that's what that's about. We're also looking in the fall at cross-device tracking in a workshop that I encourage all of you to comment on or participate in.
Do folks know what cross-device tracking is? It's a technology that tries to essentially identify when, if you see a mobile ad in your mobile phone and then you later buy it on your desktop or your tablet, they can attribute the ad to the same person and do some conversion metrics or provide compensation to the right entity, the person, the referral for the ad or for the purchase. But the technology is really interesting. So there's the signed-in services when you're logged into the same service on both devices. Obviously, that service knows you're the same user. But there's a lot of probabilistic techniques that try to monitor either location or the same IP address or things like the browsing behavior. You browse the same types of sites with using browser fingerprinting as well to identify that it's the same user. And it breaks a lot of our context boundaries of like this device is for home and this device is for work. One of the neat uses or surprising uses are, for example, a company that uses audio beacons, right? So there are ad libraries that essentially emit ultrasonic audio sounds from one phone that the ad library on the other phone is listening on the mic and then attributes those two devices as related, right? And so this workshop, we want to kind of try to understand some of the technologies that are used, some of the techniques, what are the consumer choices that they have, what is the notice given to consumers, and what are the trade-offs. And so that's in the fall. If you're interested in it, it's on the FTC webpage for CrossDevice Tracking, or you can hit me up as well. I have contact information at the end.
Wait, we're still on the slide. Keep going.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. So we also put out best practices guides and things like that. We have a new Start with Security initiative and a new guide out that's based on all of the FTC enforcement on consumer data security and all of the best practices and lessons learned from those cases. There's more than 50 of them. That guide is currently available, and we're going to be having different, we'll call them workshops and convenings around the country starting in the fall. Those are the first couple. Our chairwoman will be in San Francisco in September. I'll be in Austin in November, and we're going to have more after that. And then there's tech at FTC.
Yeah, so we also,
contact information.
There is, but we also on that blog publish things like what are some best practices, like with regards to development, concepts like the principle of least privilege, how to handle permissions properly. We try to identify key areas that are pitfalls or key best practices that companies and startups can consider when they're building stuff. And again, this is where this community and other OWASP and others help really inform what are those practices. So again, I encourage you to engage with us and do what you're doing to continue to push companies to prioritize privacy and security as one of the key facets when they're developing new stuff.
So finally, one of the other tools that we've been using in the last couple of years relatively effectively that harnesses the real raw horsepower of technologists are contests. So a few years ago, Congress passed a law that allows us to now run contests to solve problems that have been tricky for us. One of them has been the scourge of robocalls. Many of you may have gotten these phone calls either on your mobile phone or if you still have one, a landline. And these are, when you have a robot voice, this is Rachel from customer service, I'm calling because you've won whatever. You get these calls even if you're on the do not call list, which by the way, we operate with the FCC. Well, it's really annoying, right? Because if you're on the do not call list, you're not supposed to be getting these kinds of calls. And the fact is the robot can sort of, undermine the whole system. So we created a series of contests that have already provided new consumer-facing tools to block robocalls, have provided us with new law enforcement tools, better honeypots, so that we are better able to detect them. And this week we're running, so these are some of the zapping, Rachel, was last year. This year we're running Humanity Strikes Back. So this is a contest that's been in several phases. The final phase is in DEF CON Saturday, where we are going to be taking a look at a couple of new tools that are being created that will allow consumers not only to hopefully capture the robocall number, but then sort of forward it seamlessly into better honeypot and better technology for us. And so we're trying to provide new tools to help deal with this problem, even though we already have law enforcement authority that is meant to address it.
Right, sometimes you need technology. So the issue she was highlighting is that attribution for robocalls and having automated dialers is very hard now, right? You can use cloud services and Wow. And so sometimes you need to throw technology at it. And so these contests are building tools and techniques in combination with our law enforcement authority to combat these issues, right? I'm sure you have all received one, or most importantly, your grandma has received one and maybe submitted her information, which is somewhat a big issue. The other thing that we're doing is I helped set up this internal in-house research group called the Office of Technology Research and Investigation. It doesn't roll off the tongue, but essentially we try to look at new emerging technologies and do our own research, our own measurement, our own analysis. We have 2 interns that are actually here today that are working with us in the front row, and we're continuing.
They had to sit there. You know that, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. And we're continuing to bring additional resources in-house. We're hiring. I'll talk about that at the end. But some of the issues we're looking at is IoT, connected cars, this idea of algorithmic transparency, which sounds like another not rolling off the tongue, but this issue around algorithms, right? And so some of my past work was to show, for example, companies charging consumers different prices for things based on where they were located or what other websites they visit, and ultimately trying to get an idea of what are the practices in all of the algorithms we interact with on a daily basis. And one of the ways I use to highlight this issue is, for example, how many use Google Maps today or some sort of mapping client to get around, right? Show of hands. People, it's often a service we use, but do we have any idea to know whether the algorithm is giving us the best route to a place, or whether it's routing us in front of a store that gives them money, or a billboard that has essentially provided them some service? I don't want to pick on Google. There are other companies that every algorithm that you interact with, do you have a way to know what the underlying code is doing and what the biases are? And so that's an area that I'm very interested in and that we're going to be trying to do in this research shop. We'll have some info at the end about how to engage with us.
Can I just jump in on this? Because I think it's the point that we're really trying to underscore here, which is that we have this 100-year-old authority in this one, 100-year-old institution that's meant to protect consumers. And what we've been trying to do is make sure that we can modernize ourselves and keep pace with where consumers actually are and stay on top of the issues that are actually confronting them, which is why the role of technologists like Ashkan have really expanded within the FTC, why we have OTRI, you guys too, and why we are here making a plug for your help.
Here.
Oh, other big debates. So these are all that we decided we were like getting so focused on our little world that we wanted to make sure that we didn't lose sight of the fact that technologists can and should play a vital role in a number of these big debates that are currently happening in DC. Data security, of course, today in the Senate, cyber. I don't even know the status of the vote this morning,
there's literally a bill
maybe
that was
somebody
supposed
does.
to pass today on CISA, on information sharing. That's, again, my understanding is not a lot of technologists were engaged on what the specifics are, and how the language is written is going to effectively affect all of us, right? Both from the side of information sharing as well as consumers. And so these are critical debates that are happening right now, many of you know, and many of these you may not be aware of, but it's important to essentially be mindful of them and really engage on any
of them, yeah.
And so, many people play Call of Duty. Yes, it's quite fun, right? But there's another Call of Duty, right, which is essentially, making yourself heard, providing input, engaging in these policy debates, right? So it's not always fun, although, telling a bunch of high-powered attorneys or policymakers they're completely wrong about something is pretty fun sometimes. Ultimately, though, the reason of why you should do this isn't the pay, it isn't the the status, but ultimately, if you don't do this, other people will, right? People that tout, and I don't want to pick on a particular senator, but people that in DC that tout themselves as the flip phone caucus, people that don't have a smartphone, tout the fact that they don't use email, that have no real understanding of internet protocols, but that are writing laws that will affect each and every one of you. And so that's essentially kind of the call to duty.
Yeah, so in case you just tuned out everything that we just said, there's some takeaways for you, and they basically underscore these points, right? Which is technologists matter, and they should help inform our laws and our policy making and our law enforcement. We definitely have an open door, and we listen when we hear about research, so we really need your help. And we'd like you to come help with. So that's our contact information.
Yes,
We're
so my
also on
blog,
Twitter.
ftc.gov/tech or ftc.gov/OTRI. I'm Tech FTC, she's TMC, McSweeny, FTC. And I do want to underscore this kind of second point of your work has impact. One other piece to be mindful of is, as I said, so many of our investigations and even our policy is informed by this community. But we also have this one restriction, which is that we cannot disclose ongoing, it's a criminal liability if we disclose.
It's really bad.
It's bad. If we disclose the existence of an ongoing investigation. So oftentimes people will send things to me or engage me, and our cases take 1 to 2 years sometimes, right? And so we will not be able to come to you to ask questions or to get more information, but we do hear you, and it's very valuable stuff. I'll give you an example. I worked at the FTC as one of the first technologists in 2010, and then in between there I've been doing a bunch of other stuff, and I recently joined. But in that middle time, I would come across research, or I would myself do research that I knew would be of interest to the FTC. And so I'd write it up in a blog. Sometimes we'd get some press coverage, but I was always very sure at the very end to write the FAQ and methodology of how to reproduce this in isolation, and what are the steps, and what are the forensic pieces that someone like the FTC or an AG might be interested in, because it's something that we can't go back to you and say, hey, let me have your script that you use to find that CA vulnerability, right? So that's just a point I wanted to make, is we do hear you, we just can't often reach out and engage in the same way, although we're going to be starting a series of workshops and conversations with the community more broadly to have a dialogue less about enforcement of individual matters, but to help educate us on what's going on. And so we have about 6 minutes left. We were going to open it up to questions, and if not, I'm also happy to talk about some of the kind of tips and tricks on talking to policymakers. We can do a little bit of both. So why don't we open it up first, and then if there aren't any questions, I'm happy to talk you through some of the kind of what I've observed as ways to engage in policy effectively, because as geeks, sometimes we're bad at focusing or presenting things in the language that is important to.
And after you get Ashkan's tips, you can come practice on me and see if I understand anything that you've told me.
So hi, I'm Andrew Conway from Cloudmark. We provide spam filtering services for a number of large ISPs, and since a lot of consumer fraud starts with an email message, we have a lot of visibility into that, and we have on occasion shared information with the FTC, and as you point out, we never hear anything back and until sometimes a couple of years later there's an indictment, which is great. I do have one criticism, I would say, in that a consent order is fine against a big company like a Google where you just want them to fix the problem. But for the smaller operators who are genuinely malicious, mostly the FTC's enforcement consists of making them give the money back. And there are no criminal penalties, there is nothing punitive about that. You gave the example of the diet clothing. And, a friend of mine posted something about diet clothing, completely different diet clothing on Facebook just this week. So it's, can I maybe suggest that you look for laws that they're breaking that involve criminal penalties, and if that is not within the reach of the FTC, then find someone in the Department of Justice or the Secret Service for wire fraud who can maybe put these people in prison, because that's the only thing. Even if you stop one individual, if there's nothing punitive going on, you'll get others coming in to fill that ecological niche.
Well, you're raising a really important point, and one I should have underscored at the beginning, which is the FTC has civil authority. We don't have criminal authority. We do work very carefully both with our state partners and with our federal law enforcement partners when we detect criminal activity, and we can refer it over to DOJ as well. But as you point out, this is kind of a game of whack-a-mole. People who want to scam people will constantly find ways to do that, right? And they'll use all the technological capabilities available to them to conduct their scams. So we can get consumers their money back if we can get the money and it hasn't all been spent. A lot of times it has been. We can keep those guys under order. If they break an order again, then we do have them for contempt. That's a penalties start accruing then. But our legal authorities are limited in that way. So we have to sort of do our process. But I think it's an important point.
And we do get to see stuff and like break down doors sometimes. So. Any other questions?
There's one right there.
Yeah, to the right.
So you earlier mentioned the Trendnet security cameras not following appropriate practices. How do you bring up, in the world where we've got basically many different rebranders that are bringing in and selling insecure, like Hikvision is resold by Swan and Lorex at Costco, and they have the same problems that you mentioned. Obviously, the FTC's enforcement against Trendnet was ineffective because the same problems that were incumbent within the Trendnet things, Trendnet cameras, are still happening and being resold at public, So how do you handle?
Yes.
How does the FTC handle that, and what is the best way as technologists we can bring this to the attention and know that we're getting traction? Because it really does seem like we throw things at a giant wall. You give us an email that is tech@FTC, which doesn't seem like a way to reach out to somebody. Right. And you said the legal thing earlier, but we can't even track metadata about this. Like, well, there have been 5,000 complaints about this particular thing. Here's the upvotes for it.
So we do have a complaint system, and we do have, and Tech FTC is actually my email. But the answer is yes. The pipeline issue or the supply chain issue is a huge issue in IoT. We released a report last year or this year on the state of IoT and called for things like manufacturers to look at the supply chain. And we do rebranded things, rebranded software or hardware is a concern, and we do bring investigations. We can't go after all of them, but we try to either using our enforcement authority or our policy authority try to highlight or take action against some of these problems that, like you mentioned, which is common chipset vulnerabilities in routers or IoT devices or...
Well, I guess I'm asking about the retailers. You're going after the companies, which isn't always possible because they're hidden in another country. Mm-hmm. Does the FTC have the authority to try to, when you have something that's clearly insecure that they've taken action against before, do you have the authority to go after the people who are rebranding or who are selling?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, if there's a contractual relationship and they're rebranding and things like that, then yes, we do.
So the manufacturer may be in China, but the company is in the U.S., and we can, in fact, take action against the company that's branded and engaging with consumers and selling that device to consumers.
Yeah. But I also want to underscore, your point, in the IoT space, and our report flags this, it flags it also for legislators on the Hill, right? There's a wide range of security practices, and not everybody is getting the memo to really design with security in mind. And they aren't aware of the FTC or its enforcement capabilities, and we can't go after every single person. So we're aware of the fact that there are going to be a lot of these consumer-facing products that do have security issues associated with them. It's one reason we want to get the benefit of your help. And I think it's another one that we put on the list of hot policy debates that we think that everybody should be caring about, right? We also called for comprehensive data security legislation in our report.
Yep, and tell us what to do, right? So it is the pipeline issue, supply chain issue of IoT devices is huge. I agree. We have only 2 more minutes, so why don't we take the 3 questions that are remaining? Just go ahead and ask it, and then we'll try to answer all 3 in succession. So go ahead on the left.
So if you wanted to be, I guess, a technologist advisor, are there buzzwords or how did you get into this to the point? It sounds really cool to do that, so.
Yep. Okay. Next question on the right.
I was kind of curious about your jurisdiction.
Can you speak a Hey, Natasha.
I was curious about your jurisdiction over non-commercial entities. So for example, open source tools, nonprofits, there's a lot of medical hacking devices that are coming out that either try and diagnose something or share your information, like records and whatnot. I was kind of curious if you had jurisdiction over that or if we were completely on our own.
Okay, and then last question.
I was curious about, I know you guys are looking more into, connected vehicles. I saw it listed up there. Mm-hmm. And in light of what happened with the Jeep Cherokee, is there urgency to maybe enforce more requirements, or what is the FTC's position or responsibility there?
So I can take the first one, you the second one, and then
Yep.
we can tag team on the third one. So in terms of how to get into the space, I mean, really, it's publish. Start there. You would be amazed how starved DC is for people that know what the hell they're talking about. But the key is that can also talk to policymakers. I had a whole kind of slide on some of the key issues of understanding where they're coming from in the debate, being able to use simple language, not telling them all of the details, but figuring out what the crux or the pivot point in terms of the law is, and being able to voice things in that simple but accurate, finding metaphors that are, consistent, that really work, that for example, are historically used in law, like whether it's a phone booth or whether it's public space, but that are maintained in the technology as well. And then in terms of how to engage, there are literally, if you don't want to come to the FTC, there are tons of groups doing policy at a local level too. So a bunch of the state AGs are bringing on technologists in-house. There's not great keywords except maybe tech policy and privacy and security. But I'm hiring for this. For example, so I am hiring, actually, we're looking for a research coordinator if people are interested in working and doing and conducting research at the FTC. Definitely email me or look at the OTRI page. But there's not there's not a box we fit in, right? We're not lawyers. We're not like CSIT guys. We're not fixing your desktop, right? We're this weird category of thing, and there's not a really good resource that I know of that that draws these people, and so it's a lot of organic word of mouth. But come see me or talk to CDT, other organizations. Joe Hall has made the same call for the need for technologists. So just try to engage in ways you can and try to be out there.
So we had nonprofit jurisdiction. The answer is we don't, but I'd be happy to have Congress fix that for us. Oh, and connected cars.
Oh, yes, connected cars are important. These are things that will kill people if you crash them. We are very interested in the area. There's a lot of other agencies involved. There's also a lot of groups, industry groups that are involved, and so we're trying to take a survey and understand what the state of the ecosystem is, but things like cars and drones and things that can hit you in the head are bad usually.
Yes,
they're bad when they get hacked.
I was going to say, they're good. They're good innovations.
Things, but they're bad when they hit you in the head. Sorry.
I would just add to that, it's a really interesting evolution, what's happening in the connected car space from a privacy and a security perspective. So over the last year, you have the industry coming together. You have them promulgating some privacy self-reg. That's interesting to look at. Doesn't really touch this sort of public safety security vulnerability problem that you're talking about. I think they're now looking at and more aware and increasingly aware of that as an issue that they're going to need to tackle. Certainly, we're going to continue to want to work carefully on protecting consumer security and safety in the IoT space.
And we said this before, but remember, we don't require perfect security, right? We require process and reasonable security in light of an ecosystem. And that analysis has a number of factors, including the practices, the vulnerabilities, the harm to consumers, the benefits to consumers. And so we're still trying, this is a very new area, and we're trying to really engage. So the more we're informed, the better. And so with that, I think we're done. Thank you very much for coming. And if you want to follow up,